Welcome back to Daily Gossip. Grab your coffee, whether you are commuting in London, winding down in Berlin, or just waking up in New York or Los Angeles. If you've been following the news cycle over the last 24 hours, you are probably feeling a profound sense of whiplash. The headlines are screaming, the markets are jittery, and the talking heads on television are spinning themselves into a frenzy. But today, we are going to step away from the noise. We are going to look past the ticker tape and the breathless breaking news alerts, because what is actually happening in the world right now is far more terrifying, and frankly, far more historic than a simple dispute over a ceasefire. Before we dive into the deep end of this geopolitical shift, I want to take a quick second to ask you a favor. Producing this level of deep dive, independent analysis takes an incredible amount of time and resources. If you find value in what we do here at Daily Gossip, if you want to understand the structure of the world rather than just reacting to its symptoms, please hit that subscribe button. Leave a like, drop a comment, and share this episode. Your support is literally the only thing that keeps this channel running and allows us to bring you the unvarnished truth every single week. We are building a community of critical thinkers here, and we need you in it. So, let us start with a juxtaposition, a tale of two very different moments that occurred simultaneously on May 31, 2026. On one side of the globe, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy released a statement. It was a mundane, bureaucratic announcement, but its implications were seismic. They confirmed that 28 vessels had just crossed the Strait of Hormuz. We are talking about 28 massive ships, oil tankers, container ships, commercial cargo vessels. And here is the kicker. Every single one of them crossed after receiving permits directly from Iran. Not from the United States Navy. Not from a multinational coalition. Not from any recognized international maritime authority. They asked for permission from Tehran, they paid their fees, and they crossed. I want you to just let that sit for a moment and digest what it really means. At the exact same time, literally as those ships were navigating the strait under Iranian administration, on the other side of the world, it was 5 p.m. in Washington, D.C. Donald Trump walked into the Situation Room. For those who might not be intimately familiar with White House architecture, the Situation Room is the nerve center of American global power. It is the subterranean room where presidents make the gravest wartime decisions, where Osama bin Laden's compound was monitored, where the Cuban Missile Crisis was debated. Trump sat down with his top military and national security advisors. He looked at the proposals regarding the ongoing conflict and the potential ceasefire. And then he stood up and left. No decision was made. Nothing was signed. Nothing was announced to the press. He simply walked out. We are currently living in an extraordinary, almost surreal reality. On the exact same day, the most powerful military machine in the history of human civilization could not force a strategic decision from its own commander-in-chief, while a country that has been buckling under the weight of American and international sanctions for 45 years is casually collecting toll fees from ships traversing the world and Oppo's most critical economic waterway. Now, if you open any major newspaper today, whether it is the New York Times, Le Monde, or the Financial Times, the opinion columns are obsessing over the same trivial questions. Will Trump sign the deal? Will the ceasefire hold? What are the exact terms of the uranium enrichment limits? Who is supposedly, and quote, winning, and quote, the negotiation? I am here to tell you as clearly as I can that these are the wrong questions. They are a distraction. If you are asking who is winning the news cycle today, you are completely missing the structural collapse that is happening right under our feet. Today, I am going to walk you through what the right question actually is, because once you understand the underlying architecture of this moment, the daily headlines will stop confusing you. The chaos will suddenly make a very grim, very cold kind of sense. To understand this, we need to completely discard a concept that has been dominating the cocktail parties of foreign policy intellectuals for the last decade. Back in mid-May of 2026, just a couple of weeks ago, Chinese President Xi Jinping sat down with Donald Trump at a highly publicized summit in Beijing. During that meeting, Xi Jinping brought up something that immediately set the think tank world on fire. He asked whether China and the United States could overcome what he referred to as the, quote, Thucydides trap. And, quote, immediately every academic, every geopolitical YouTuber, and every newspaper columnist started churning out content about this trap. Is war inevitable? Can diplomacy save us? For those who haven and oppose, read ancient Greek history lately, the Thucydides trap is a concept popularized by a Harvard professor named Graham Allison, drawing on the writings of the ancient historian Thucydides who chronicled the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. The theory essentially posits that when a rising, dynamic power threatens to overtake an established, dominant power, the resulting friction almost inevitably leads to outright war. Allison looked at 16 historical case studies, and in 12 of them, the outcome was massive bloodshed. So, when Xi Jinping uses this phrase, he isn't just making polite historical conversation. He is deploying a very specific strategic narrative. He is implicitly framing China as the rising Athens and America as the aging, established Sparta. His argument is that history dictates this will end in war unless the established power, America, graciously accommodates the rise of the challenger. But there is a massive logical flaw in this framing, one that brilliant scholars like Miles Yu at the Hudson Institute have rightfully pointed out. If you actually read Thucydides to the end of the story, you realize who actually won the Peloponnesian War. Sparta won. The established, conservative, dominant land power crushed the rising, dynamic naval power. Athens lost everything. Their fleet was burned, their empire was dismantled, and their vaunted democracy was overthrown by oligarchs. So, if Beijing truly wants to cast itself as the Athens of the 21st century, the historical precedent suggests they should expect utter ruin, not that Washington should roll out the red carpet for them. The historical metaphor cuts in the exact opposite direction of how it is being used. However, debating ancient Greece is ultimately missing the forest for the trees. The fundamental problem with the entire Thucydides trap conversation is that it focuses our anxiety on the wrong disaster. It asks, will these two superpowers launch nuclear missiles at each other? But as anyone living in the real world of 2026 can feel in their bones, a direct World War III is not the most immediate threat. The most dangerous scenario facing you, your family, your pension, and your grocery bills is not that America and China go to war. The most dangerous scenario is that neither America nor China is willing to maintain the basic global order that our modern, interconnected lives depend upon. This brings us to the actual framework we need to be using. It is not the Thucydides trap. It is the Kindleberger trap. Charles Kindleberger was a brilliant American economic historian. He studied the Great Depression of 1929, trying to understand why a standard financial panic metastasized into a decade of global misery that eventually birthed fascism and World War II. His core, revolutionary insight was this: the Great Depression did not happen because the world suddenly ran out of money or resources. It happened because the world ran out of leadership. Before World War I, the British Empire was the guarantor of the global system. They secured the seas, backed the currency, and enforced the rules. But by the 1920s, Britain was financially exhausted and psychologically broken by the trenches of the Somme. They could no longer afford to be the world and Oppo's policeman. Meanwhile, the United States was rising as an economic titan, but America was deeply isolationist. Washington was not yet ready, nor willing, to take up the mantle of global leadership. Kindleberger realized that in that space between a retreating hegemon and a reluctant successor, a vacuum opened up. And in that vacuum, the entire global system collapsed. Countries threw up tariffs, supply chains shattered, and authoritarianism thrived. The Kindleberger trap, therefore, dictates that the world falls apart not because powerful nations actively try to destroy each other, but because no powerful nation is willing to foot the bill to maintain the, global commons. The global commons are the things we all take for granted: open shipping lanes, enforceable trading rules, basic security guarantees, and a stable reserve currency. If you take an honest look at the geopolitical landscape of 2026, you will see the Kindleberger trap springing shut around us. Look past the daily outrage on social media and look at the structure. The current American administration's policy is explicitly, America first, and whatever you think of that politically, structurally it means Washington is no longer willing to subsidize the security of the free world. There is a deep, bipartisan exhaustion with the costs of empire. The United States is no longer interested in absorbing the financial and military burden of maintaining a global system where, frankly, nations in Europe and Asia often reap more economic benefits than the American working class does. America has transitioned from being the global sheriff to being a transactional actor, using its formidable leverage strictly for short-term, concrete domestic interests. On the flip side, look at China. Yes, Beijing is aggressively expanding its economic footprint. They are building ports in Africa, laying down rail lines in Asia, and locking up rare earth minerals globally. But China has absolutely zero interest in stepping up as a responsible, benevolent guarantor of the global commons. They are not sending their navy to ensure freedom of navigation for everyone else. They are not providing the public goods, the uncompensated security umbrella, that a true global hegemon must provide. So, America is stepping back and China is refusing to step forward. What happens to the vacuum? The answer is unfolding right now in the Persian Gulf. When the giants leave the room, the regional actors take over, and they do not play by the old rules. Over the last year, maritime and security analysts focused on the Indo-Pacific and the Baltic Sea have documented a terrifying, unprecedented spike in physical attacks on undersea cables. These are the arteries of our modern world, carrying 95% of all international internet traffic and trillions of dollars in daily financial transactions. These cables are being sabotaged by commercial vessels equipped with dual-use technology, operating in the gray zone of deniability. And because America doesn't oppose, want the hassle and China doesn't oppose, care there are no investigations, there are no attributions, there are no consequences. The attacks just become part of the background noise of a decaying world. Marco Vincenzo, one of the sharpest geopolitical risk analysts operating today, recently commented on the ongoing situation in the Strait of Hormuz. He articulated the reality of the Kindleberger Trap flawlessly. He noted that we are no longer living in a binary world of open versus closed waterways. We are shifting, he said, from a state of total closure to a state of conditional access, He explicitly warned that there will be no return to safe, predictable, universal maritime routes. The era of the open seas is over. His key phrase, the one that should keep policymakers awake at night, is this, all we have now is crisis management, but not crisis resolution. Think about what conditional access actually means. It means the global commons are being privatized by force. They are being carved up by regional powers who now have the leverage to set their own terms, extract their own fees, and impose their own ideological conditions. This results in a world that is inherently more unstable, radically more unpredictable, and vastly more expensive for everyone. And who pays the price? Not the superpowers. The price is paid by the nations in Europe, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, who are not powerful enough to send an aircraft carrier to protect their own supply lines. 28 commercial ships crossing the Strait of Hormuz today with Iranian-issued permits is not a quirk of wartime diplomacy. It is the Kindleberger Trap made manifest. It is the New World Order, and it is highly conditional. Let us transition and focus specifically on Iran, because to understand how the United States got outmaneuvered so badly, we have to look at the tactical reality on the ground. A metaphor circulating among intelligence analysts lately compares this conflict to a game of chess. It is incredibly fitting, considering the game itself has Persian origins. The phrase, checkmate, derives from the Persian, shahmat, meaning, the king is dead, The consensus is growing that throughout this war, Iran has been playing at the level of a grandmaster, while the United States has approached the board with the impulsive brute force of a novice playing checkers. For decades, American military doctrine has been stubbornly addicted to the concept of, shock and awe, The Pentagon's theory of victory is almost cinematic. You deploy overwhelming technological superiority, you launch precision strikes to decapitate the enemy and oppo's leadership, you blind their communications, and you wait for their command structure to collapse in panic. And to be fair, they executed this playbook perfectly in the opening hours of this conflict. American and Israeli forces launched an incredibly sophisticated, devastating strike directly targeting Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran. It was a success. He died. State media in Tehran eventually confirmed that he had chosen to remain in the capital to die with his people rather than fleeing to a bunker in Moscow. The strike wiped out his family, his daughter, his son-in-law, his grandchildren. If you apply conventional Western military logic, this should have been the end of the war. You cut off the head of the snake and the body dies. But the Grandmaster was already 3 moves ahead. Iran had spent the last 45 years, ever since the Islamic Revolution, studying American warfare. They knew a decapitation strike was inevitable. So, they designed their military architecture to render it meaningless. They developed what military strategists call mosaic defense, Instead of a rigid, top-down hierarchy centered in Tehran, the Iranian military apparatus is decentralized across 31 provinces. These are essentially 31 independent, self-sufficient cells. Each has its own localized strategy, its own stockpile of weapons, its own internal chain of command. They do not need a supreme leader to tell them what to do next. When Khamenei was killed, the system did exactly what it was designed to do. It functioned as a massive national dead man and oppos, switch, The retaliatory orders had been given years in advance. The ballistic missiles were already pre-programmed with coordinates. The drone swarms were already positioned. Killing the leadership Didin and oppos stopped the war. It simply activated the autonomous phase of it. Then, there is the brutal, unforgiving economic math of modern warfare, an area where America is currently bleeding out. Let's talk real numbers, because numbers Don and oppos spin. The Shahid drones that Iran is deploying in massive waves cost, at the absolute maximum, $50,000 to produce. Some intelligence estimates suggest they have optimized the manufacturing down to $35,000 per unit. Iran is currently churning out roughly 500 of these drones every single day, drawing from a pre-war stockpile estimated at 80,000 units. Now, look at the American response. To shoot down one of these glorified flying lawnmowers, the United States relies on its top-tier air defense networks, the Patriot missile systems and the THAAD batteries. A single interceptor missile from these systems costs American taxpayers approximately $1 million. And in real-world combat scenarios, you often have to fire 2 or 3 interceptors to guarantee a kill against an evasive drone. Do the math. The United States is spending anywhere from $2 to $3 million to destroy a piece of plastic and explosive that cost Iran less than a mid-sized sedan. You cannot win a war of attrition with that kind of balance sheet. You will bankrupt your empire before you dent their stockpile. The Pentagon has spent weeks boasting to the press about achieving air superiority over Iran. But when independent analysts peel back the propaganda, a very different picture emerges. Yes, American bombers hit targets. They aggressively bombed civilian cargo ships docked in Iranian ports, and then proudly declared to the media that they had devastated the Iranian Navy. But the reality is that the U.S. military merely rearranged the deck chairs on the surface. They hit above-ground infrastructure, Iran's actual warfighting capacity, their vast arsenals of ballistic missiles, their subterranean drone factories, their deeply buried nuclear enrichment facilities, was barely scratched. One prominent defense analyst summed it up with brutal honesty, noting that the U.S. bombed civilian ships and claimed a naval victory, while Iran's true military core remained intact beneath the mountains. While America was wasting million-dollar missiles and declaring premature victories, Iran's counteroffensive was unfolding with terrifying precision on multiple fronts. Their relentless drone and missile barrages achieved something historically unprecedented. They forced United States aircraft carriers and destroyers to retreat away from the Iranian coast, pushing them out of their optimal operational zones. Furthermore, Iranian forces relentlessly struck American military installations scattered throughout the Gulf states. These Aran and oppos minor skirmishes. Internal Pentagon memos have described some of these highly fortified bases as nearly uninhabitable, The damage was so severe that American service members had to be evacuated and housed in civilian hotels in Allied cities. And in a move that underscores the total collapse of U.S. operational security, Iranian intelligence tracked those soldiers to those specific civilian hotels and launched strikes against them. But the most chilling aspect of Iran and oppos' strategy, the one that the mainstream Western media has almost entirely ignored, is the weaponization of water. If you look at the Gulf Cooperation Council states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, they share a fatal geographic vulnerability. They have virtually no natural fresh water. These glittering, futuristic metropolises in the desert rely on massive desalination plants for over 60% of their water supply. Iran possesses the absolute capability to wipe out these desalination plants overnight using their cheap drone swarms. A $50,000 drone can destroy a multi-billion-dollar facility that keeps millions of people alive. And before you ask if those plants can be defended by American Patriot batteries, remember the math we just discussed and look at the track record. Those same air defense systems have repeatedly failed to stop saturated drone swarms in Israel and in the Gulf itself. The GCC is entirely exposed. So you have Iran, historically and geographically protected by vast, rugged mountain ranges that conceal its military assets, looking down at a flat, indefensible desert. Every Saudi oil field, every Emirati port, every hotel hiding American troops, and every desalination plant is a sitting duck. As if to rub salt in the wound of American naval pride, on May 31st, right in the middle of Tehran and Apos, Encalab Square, Iran unveiled a new naval attack vessel. They named it the 27th of Rajab. This ISN and Apos, TA Rusty patrol boat. It is engineered to hit speeds of 100 knots, that is 185 kilometers per hour on the water, and it is fully integrated to launch long-range cruise missiles. They paraded this new symbol of maritime projection on the exact same day they were calmly issuing permits for global shipping to cross the Strait of Hormuz. I ask you, does that look like the behavior of a nation that is losing a war to the United States? Moving beyond the military hardware, we have to look at the administrative reality being forged in the strait. Iran is not executing a chaotic, temporary blockade. That is what a weak power does. A smart power establishes bureaucracy. Iran has essentially stood up a fully functioning maritime authority for the Strait of Hormuz. A draft of what is being called the Islamabad Agreement leaked on Iranian state television recently, and it is a masterclass in bureaucratic hegemony. Under this agreement, Tehran grants itself the legal authority to classify the nature of any vessel entering the strait, mandate the submission of cargo manifests, conduct physical onboard inspections of ships they deem suspicious, and, of course, collect navigation service fees. They are not closing the strait. They are governing it. And for the long-term stability of the global order, that distinction is catastrophic. A closed strait is a crisis that demands an international military response. A managed strait normalizes Iranian dominance. It turns a hostile takeover into a boring administrative hurdle for global shipping companies. It establishes a new baseline reality on the ground. As Marco Vincenzo pointed out, anyone in London or Washington who believes a signed ceasefire document will magically return the world to the status quo of 2023 is dangerously deluded. Temporary calm does not equal strategic stability. The rules have permanently changed. To understand why the American response has been so disastrously ineffective, international political analysts have coined two acronyms that perfectly encapsulate the structural dysfunction in Washington right now. They sound slightly ridiculous, but they are deadly serious in their accuracy. The first is taco, end quote. Trump always chickens out, end quote. The second is nacho, end quote. Not a chance Hormuz opens, end quote. Let's unpack taco first, because it explains the bizarre diplomatic theater we are witnessing. When the Trump administration initiated this conflict, their stated objectives were nothing short of maximalist. They weren't and oppose, looking for a border adjustment. They demanded total regime change in Tehran. They demanded unconditional surrender. They demanded the complete, verifiable dismantlement of every single centrifuge in Iran's nuclear program and the destruction of their ballistic missile capabilities. Fast forward to today. What is the American superpower actually negotiating in these backdoor channels? They are begging for a measly 60-day memorandum of understanding. In exchange for what? For some incredibly vague, heavily caveat language regarding Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium, and a murky promise to discuss the conditions under which Hormuz might return to normal traffic. Robert Kagan, a veteran foreign policy hawk, looked at the draft agreements and stated unequivocally that the outcome Trump is driving toward is tantamount to American surrender. The political blowback within the United States is vicious. Sitting Republican senators, men like Lindsey Graham, Ted Cruz, and Roger Wicker, alongside former CIA Director Mike Pompeo, are publicly eviscerating their own president. They are going on cable news and accusing Trump of architecting a worse, weaker version of the JCPOA, the Obama-era nuclear deal that Trump himself famously campaigned against and tore up in 2018, calling it the worst deal in history. Trump and Oppo's own fiercely loyal political base is watching him capitulate to the very forces he promised to destroy. That is the essence of TACO. Maximalist rhetoric, shrinking outcomes, and a total failure of political will when the costs become real. The evidence of this chaos is playing out hour by hour. Just a couple of days ago, on May 29th, Trump convened his team in the Situation Room. According to leaks provided to Axios, he balked at the deal his own envoys had drafted. He realized it made him look weak, so he demanded last-minute amendments, tougher language on how the uranium stockpile would be physically removed or destroyed, and firmer guarantees about the strait. He sent his diplomats scrambling back to the table. White House officials are whispering to friendly reporters that they hope to have a deal, end quote, by the turn of the week, end quote. But Tehran is playing a completely different game. Iranian negotiators have made it crystal clear to the international press that nothing is finalized and that three massive, structural hurdles remain. First, they are demanding the immediate, unconditional release of $12 billion in frozen assets the second any deal is announced. The U.S. is desperately trying to make it a gradual, performance-based release, but Iran refuses. Second, Iran is no longer just asking for sanctions relief. They are demanding war reparations. They have framed it as a, end quote, reconstruction fund, end quote, targeting $300 billion to compensate for American and Israeli strikes. Washington is entirely ignoring this, but Tehran won and Oppo's drop it. Finally, Iran demands that sanctions on its crucial oil and petrochemical sectors be lifted immediately, while negotiations are still ongoing, as a gesture of goodwill. These are not minor disagreements over commas in a treaty. These are irreconcilable differences regarding sovereignty, leverage, and national humiliation. And crucially, while the diplomats argue, the Revolutionary Guard keeps shooting. Just today, the IRGC proudly announced they shot down a state-of-the-art US MQ-1 Predator drone that strayed into their airspace. Their press release was chillingly confident. They noted it was targeted by indigenous defense systems and reiterated that any further American aggression would be met decisively. They are talking peace while demonstrating absolute military confidence. Then we have the other side of the American policy failure, Nacho, end quote, not a chance Hormuz opens, end quote. This refers to the deeply hypocritical, chaotic nature of the U.S. naval blockade. The Pentagon wants the world to believe they have clamped an iron fist around the Iranian coast. And occasionally they act like it. Recently, U.S. forces fired a Hellfire missile directly into the engine room of the M/V Lion Star, a commercial vessel flying a Gambian flag in the Gulf of Oman. The ship had apparently ignored dozens of radio warnings and was making a run for an Iranian port. The missile crippled the ship entirely. CENTCOM, the U.S. command in the region, boasts that they have disabled 5 commercial vessels and forced over 100 others to divert. But look beneath the surface of these tough guy press releases, and you see the Kindleberger Trap in action. While the U.S. Navy is firing missiles at random Gambian ships, investigative reporting has revealed that the American military is quietly colluding with other commercial vessels to help them turn off their AIS tracking transponders so they can slip through the strait undetected by Iranian shore batteries. Even worse, the U.S. is turning a blind eye and quietly allowing massive Qatari oil tankers to cross the strait after those tankers have explicitly paid the Iranian navigation tolls. On one hand, America is bombing ships to enforce a blockade. On the other hand, they are helping ships sneak through the back door and tacitly approving of allies paying tribute to Tehran. This is not the behavior of a confident, dominant hegemon enforcing a rules-based order. This is the panicked improvisation of an empire that has lost control of the board. They are desperately trying to maintain the theatrical illusion of global power, while quietly accommodating the grim reality that they cannot physically force the Strait of Hormuz open. You have the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, standing at a podium in Singapore, sweating under the lights, insisting that the U.S. military posture is, end quote, stronger than ever, end quote. While on the exact same day, Iran stamps 28 transit permits for global shipping. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. But we cannot fully understand this geopolitical collapse without looking at what is happening inside the borders of the United States. Foreign policy is always a reflection of domestic reality, and the domestic reality in America right now is tearing itself apart. If you are listening to this in London or Frankfurt, you might feel somewhat insulated from the Middle East, but you feel this in your wallet. The direct financial cost of this war for the U.S. taxpayer has already hit $72 billion. That translates to roughly $1.2 billion set on fire every single day. And importantly, independent auditors note that this is 3 times higher than the Pentagon and OPPO's official, sanitized estimates. The military has already gone back to Congress, cup in hand, begging for an additional $200 billion in emergency supplemental funding. The human cost is mounting. 15 American soldiers dead, over 500 grievously wounded. We and OPPO's talked about the $800 million in structural damage to U.S. bases that are now deemed uninhabitable. But the macroeconomic shockwaves are what will define this era. Spirit Airlines, a major American budget carrier, just filed for bankruptcy because jet fuel prices have absolutely skyrocketed, up 52%, directly due to the energy bottleneck in Hormuz. Even more terrifying is the agricultural sector. There is a severe, escalating shortage of fertilizer globally because the price of sulfur, a critical component in fertilizer production that relies heavily on Gulf supply chains, has spiked by 57%. We are not talking about abstract GDP figures here. We are talking about the price of the food on your table next winter. We are talking about crippling transportation costs that feed into every single product on a store shelf. And the American public, exhausted by decades of forever wars, is finally breaking. Polling data is unambiguous. A massive majority of Americans, across the political spectrum, oppose this war. The real shocker is that 53% of voters who cast their ballot for Donald Trump actively oppose American military involvement in the specific conflict between Israel and Iran. This anger has spilled out of the polling booths and into the streets. We are seeing unprecedented social mobilization. The people in OPPO's march, the no kings movement, the coordinated economic blackouts. There is widespread organizing for what is being called the 2026 United States General Strike. Millions of citizens are preparing to shut down the domestic economy to stop a foreign war. All of this is happening while the president's approval rating languishes at a dismal 37%. The administration's response to this domestic pressure has been erratic and authoritarian. In a moment that shook global markets, Trump took to his social media platform, Truth Social, and posted a cryptic, terrifying message implying that civilization would die tonight if Iran didn't and OPPO's fold. The immediate interpretation worldwide was that the President of the United States was casually threatening a preemptive nuclear strike on a social media app. Congressional Democrats drafted papers to invoke the 25th Amendment to remove him from office. Even staunch conservative commentators begged the White House to confiscate his phone. To manage the narrative, the administration resorted to dystopian tactics. The White House Communications Office released high-production propaganda videos glorifying the war effort, which independent journalists quickly proved were spliced together using CGI footage from video games and old Hollywood action movies. The backlash was immense. Citizens accused the government of trying to turn a bloody, costly quagmire into an entertainment spectacle to boost poll numbers. When the media covered this backlash, the administration took off the gloves. The chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, a presidential appointee, publicly threatened to revoke the broadcasting licenses of major television networks that aired what the government deemed negative or unpatriotic coverage of the war. Democrats rightfully exploded, calling it a dictatorial assault on the First Amendment. This is the portrait of the nation that is supposedly responsible for defending democracy and enforcing the global rules-based order. It is a nation consuming itself from the inside out. Now, as an analyst, I believe it is intellectually dishonest to only present one side of an argument. You always have to engage with the strongest possible counterargument to your own thesis, what we call Steelmaning the opposition. So, let's look at the Steelman argument for the American position right now. The defense of Washington goes like this. Look, you can criticize the messy politics, but the United States is still the undisputed, most lethal military force on the planet. The U.S. Navy still patrols the deep blue oceans in a way no rival can even dream of. The American economy is still a juggernaut. Furthermore, the very fact that Trump and Iranian officials are negotiating, that they are exchanging drafts and fighting over uranium clauses, proves that American coercive diplomacy is working. They aren't and oppose. In a total war. They are talking. If a deal is signed, even a flawed one, it validates the strategy. It shows that American pressure forced a rogue state to the table. I want to acknowledge that this argument is not entirely without merit. It is comfortable and it relies on historical truths about American power. But when you stress test the Steelman argument against the cold, hard reality of May 2026, it completely collapses on three distinct fronts. First, let and oppose. Revisit the military reality. Intelligence assessments leaking out of Europe suggest that the massive, multi-billion-dollar American strike campaign only set Iran and oppose's nuclear program back by, at most, 1 to 2 years. More importantly, the absolute core of the threat, Iran and oppose's stockpile of highly enriched, weapons-grade uranium, is safely tucked away in labyrinthine facilities buried deep beneath mountains. The U.S. achieved, in quote, air superiority, in quote, only because they were bombing from standoff distances outside Iranian airspace, blowing up empty warehouses and commercial docks. The true teeth of the Iranian military, the deep bunkers, the dispersed drone factories, the hardened silos, survived intact. You cannot claim military dominance when the enemy and oppose's center of gravity remains completely untouched. Second, the Steelman argument relies heavily on the concept of American alliances. But look at the actual map of this conflict. America's oldest, most trusted allies have completely abandoned Washington. Spain outright closed its airspace to U.S. military transport planes. Emmanuel Macron's France refused to let Israel use French airspace to run logistics for the American war effort. Italy, a core NATO ally, revoked landing rights for U.S. military aircraft at the vital Sigonella base in Sicily. Even more devastating is the betrayal in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, historically America and oppose's closest strategic partner in the Gulf, watched the drone threat from Iran and made a chillingly pragmatic calculation. Riyadh refused to let U.S. forces operate out of the Prince Sultan Air Base. They refused to open Saudi airspace for American fighter jets striking Iran. They practically forced the Pentagon to suspend major operations. When the President of the United States calls on the world to form a coalition to escort ships through a vital waterway, and literally everyone, NATO allies, China, Russia, the Gulf states, says, in quote, no, and quote, you are not leading a coalition of the willing. You are a completely isolated actor launching unilateral strikes and desperately pretending you still have an empire behind you. Third, and this is the most critical point for the listeners in Europe and Asia, the strategic overstretch is real, and it is permanently altering the balance of power elsewhere. Because the U.S. is burning through its arsenals fighting cheap drones in the desert, they have had to inform the Japanese government that the delivery of 400 Tomahawk cruise missiles, vital for deterring North Korea and China, is being delayed by a minimum of 2 years, pushed back to 2030. Planned, heavily publicized arms sales to Taiwan have been quietly suspended because the factories in the U.S. simply cannot produce weapons fast enough to supply Taipei, Kiev, and the Gulf simultaneously. The incredible military resources that the Pentagon spent a decade meticulously positioning in the Indo-Pacific to deter Chinese expansion are being cannibalized right now to fight a pointless war of attrition over the Persian Gulf. This is the true tragedy of the historical comparisons. Thucydides didn't and oppose. Just warn about rising and falling powers. His greatest warning was about the intoxicating, suicidal nature of imperial hubris. He wrote about how the brilliant, democratic empire of Athens decided, for no vital strategic reason, to launch a massive armada against Sicily, a faraway, well-defended enemy. They thought they were invincible. The Sicilian expedition drained their treasury, destroyed their military, and led directly to the collapse of the Athenian Golden Age. America, blinded by its own rhetoric, launched an expeditionary war against a nation that has spent nearly half a century engineering a military specifically designed to absorb and counter American tactics. The outcome: ISN and Oppos, TA swift, cinematic victory. It is a grueling, humiliating quagmire that is draining the treasury, alienating the last remaining allies, sending shockwaves of inflation through the global economy, and sparking near rebellion at home. The Steelman argument: doesn't and Oppos survive contact with reality. Reality is actively dismantling it. So, let us pull all these threads together. The Thucydides' trap was the shiny object that distracted everyone. Xi Jinping and Trump met, they shook hands, and they signaled that a direct US-China war is off the table for now. The diplomats patted themselves on the back. But while the world was obsessing over Washington and Beijing avoiding World War III, the Kindleberger Trap was quietly triggered in the Middle East. America refused the burden of empire. China refused the responsibility of leadership. And into that gaping void stepped Iran. A regional, heavily sanctioned power is now the de facto administrator of the most important economic choke point on planet Earth. They are issuing the permits, setting the insurance liabilities, and drafting the regulatory framework for global energy transit. This is not a blip. It is a massive tectonic structural shift in how the world operates. And you are paying for it. If the strait remains conditionally managed by Tehran, the Japanese economy, which relies almost entirely on imported energy, faces catastrophic recession. Europe, which painstakingly decoupled from Russian gas, relies heavily on liquefied natural gas from Qatar moving through that very strait. India, South Korea, the entire developing world, they are all hostage to a waterway now managed by the Revolutionary Guard. One brilliant historian recently drew a parallel that I cannot stop thinking about. He compared America right now to the Roman Republic in the immediate aftermath of its ultimate victory over Carthage in the Punic Wars. Rome crushed its only real rival. They achieved total, unquestioned global dominance. And it was precisely from that pinnacle of supreme power that the internal rot began. The democratic institutions of the Republic were corrupted by unimaginable wealth. The military-industrial complex gained total control over foreign policy. The empire kept expanding, picking fights on the frontiers, not because Rome needed the land, but because the corrupt elites back home needed endless wars to justify their power and distract the plebeians. I am not saying Washington is literally Rome in 27 BC, but the rhyming of history is deafening. I want to leave you with 3 highly specific predictions. I believe analysts should be accountable, so keep these metrics in mind over the next few months. Prediction number 1. The entire ceasefire hinges entirely on the uranium text. The media will focus on the hostages or the political rhetoric. Ignore it. Watch the exact phrasing regarding how Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium is managed. If the final document does not include a brutal, enforceable, time-bound mechanism to physically remove that uranium, then whatever Trump signs is a fake deal. It will be a temporary pause to save face before the midterms, while the clock on an Iranian nuclear weapon keeps ticking. Prediction number 2. The Strait of Hormuz will never return to the old normal. Marco Vincenzo is right. Even if a peace treaty is signed tomorrow, the precedent has been set. Iran proved they can choke the global economy, and the US proved they cannot stop them. Shipping companies and Lloyd and Oppos, of London insurance underwriters do not care about White House press briefings. They care about mathematical risk. They will continue to price in Iranian authority over the strait. The Kindleberger Trap is now a permanent feature of maritime trade. Prediction number 3. The political civil war inside the United States is going to accelerate, regardless of the treaty. The $72 billion is gone. The inflation is baked into the supply chain. The Republican hawks will never forgive Trump for blinking, and the progressive left will never forgive him for starting it. This is a textbook case of elite overproduction. Factions of the ruling class tearing each other apart because the system is shrinking. This internal chaos guarantees that America will be utterly incapable of projecting a coherent, long-term foreign policy for the next decade. Your homework for this week is simple. Go read the leaked Axios report on Trump's desperate last-minute amendments. Compare his demands to Iran's red lines on frozen assets. That gap is the reality of American decline. Look up Marco Vincenzo's writings on conditional access. And finally, just pull up Google Maps. Look at the Strait of Hormuz. Look at the jagged, impenetrable mountains of Iran on the north and the flat, vulnerable deserts of the Gulf states on the south. The water is only 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. A fifth of the world and Oppo's energy flows through a gap you could cross in a motorboat in 20 minutes. Look at that geography and ask yourself, who actually controls that water? The Thucydides trap asks if great powers will destroy each other. The Kindleberger trap asks something much darker. What happens to you, your family, and your country when no one is left to maintain the world? When the global commons are carved up by warlords and regional powers, what does the future look like for the nations too small to build their own aircraft carriers? Idon and Oppos have a comforting answer for you. Anyone who says they do is selling you something. But understanding the structural reality of this decay, seeing the board for what it is the only way we survive it. Thank you for spending your time with me today. If this analysis helped you see the world a little more clearly, please subscribe to Daily Gossip, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and I will see you next time. Stay sharp out there.